A chilling new narrative is taking shape within the investigation of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. What follows demands close attention. Over the past 48 hours, a grim consensus has begun to emerge from expert circles, a conclusion that no one was prepared to face. It is the inevitable question that looms over every prolonged missing person investigation, the one that investigators must eventually confront, and the one that families implore journalists never to ask. It is the question that has hung unspoken over the public discourse, a dreadful possibility that has now finally been given a voice. Is Nancy Guthrie still alive? This is no longer being treated as mere theory or a heartless provocation, but as a stark forensic reality that law enforcement and medical specialists are now being forced to consider. Even former FBI agents have begun to address it head-on, understanding that the answer to this single question will dictate every subsequent move in this complex investigation. Because the developments of the last 48 hours have been unambiguous, the use of cadaver dogs has been suspended. A sleep specialist has revealed that Nancy's medical condition placed her at an extreme risk of a fatal cardiac event at the very time of her abduction. The FBI has relocated its command center from Tucson to Phoenix, and a signal detector was dispatched into the borderlands desert not, as one might assume, to locate a living kidnap victim. Instead, sources within law enforcement indicate its purpose was the search for human remains. And in an act of gut-wrenching public candor, Savannah Guthrie herself has acknowledged the possibility that her mother may already be lost. Tonight, we must undertake the task that all responsible journalism, in this case, eventually demands. We will pose the most difficult question of all, and we will meticulously examine what the evidence, the expert analysis, and the hard medical science suggest is the answer. The only place for an honest appraisal to begin is at the turning point, the precise moment the entire tone of the investigation shifted. For the initial weeks, the case proceeded with all the intensity of a life-or-death rescue mission. Hundreds of federal agents were deployed on the ground. A 24-hour command post operated out of Tucson. Teams with cadaver dogs methodically scoured the desert landscape. Helicopters patrolled the skies above the Catalina foothills, equipped with Bluetooth signal detectors, searching for a single ping from Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker. The atmosphere in those early days was electric, with the singular focus of finding a living person. It was urgent. It was relentless. A frantic race against a clock measured not in days, but in hours. And then, subtly at first, something changed. The FBI began to withdraw the majority of its Tucson-based personnel. The operational nerve center was relocated from Tucson to the larger hub in Phoenix. The sprawling, highly visible search operation that characterized the first phase of the investigation quietly consolidated into a smaller, more specialized task force. When Sheriff Nanos was questioned by the press about the cadaver dogs, a conspicuous presence in the early weeks that later vanished, his response was meticulously guarded. He stated that the dogs remained available if needed in the future, a carefully chosen phrase, available if needed. This is not the language of an official who anticipates an imminent need for such resources in the recovery of a living individual. But it was another of Nanos's remarks that sent a chill across the country. When pressed directly on whether he believed Nancy Guthrie was alive, his answer was 3 words. Anything is possible. It was not, we believe she's alive. It was not, our evidence strongly suggests she is alive. Just, anything is possible. This from the same sheriff who, only 2 weeks prior, had stated publicly and unequivocally that he was confident Nancy was still out there. The phrase marked a seismic shift in the official narrative. Which brings us to the analysis of John Miller, a chief law enforcement and intelligence analyst. Miller is not a mere commentator, nor is he a pundit paid for sensational television soundbites. He is a man with a formidable background, including high-ranking positions within the New York Police Department. He served as the Director of Intelligence and Counterterrorism for the NYPD and is regarded as one of the most credible analytical minds in American law enforcement commentary. When Miller confronted the question of Nancy's fate during a 1-month retrospective on the case, he articulated the situation with a clarity that warrants being heard in its entirety. He explained, "The question of the fate of Nancy Guthrie is a central one because, with a victim who is still alive, there is a certain sense of urgency, with a life hanging in the balance that keeps things moving at a fast pace. With a victim who you either know or presume is likely dead, the investigation can slow down and, in fact, even become more meticulous. You have a lot more time to delve into time-consuming lines of investigation that can be productive in the long term. The subtext of that statement is critical. Miller was not pronouncing Nancy Guthrie dead. He was illuminating the cold, investigative logic that is steering every decision at this very moment. If the presumption is life, the pace is frantic, the urgency absolute. All available resources are deployed in real time. If the presumption is death, the pace shifts to one that is deliberate, patient, and forensically exhaustive. This is the type of painstaking investigation designed to construct a case so solid it cannot be broken by a defense attorney. When you observe the current posture of this investigation, the reduction from hundreds of field agents to a concentrated task force, the pivot from active search to intelligence gathering, it all aligns perfectly with Miller's second scenario. This should not be mistaken for investigators giving up hope. It is far more likely a sign that they have recalibrated their entire approach. Perhaps the most difficult piece of public evidence to process in this entire conversation came directly from Savannah Guthrie, in a raw and profoundly personal message delivered to the nation via social media. Savannah gave voice to a chilling possibility, a truth that no child ever wants to articulate about a parent who has vanished. She conceded that her mother might already be gone. She then added, "If she is in heaven with loved ones who have passed, then we will accept it." Yet, the family's demand for answers persisted. One must pause to consider the weight of that admission. A daughter, bracing herself in public for the probability that her mother was no longer among the living. This was not an abandonment of hope, but a stark recognition that hope alone might prove insufficient against a brutal reality. Former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe offered a professional interpretation of what such a public declaration indicates about the intensely private discussions taking place out of view. He explained to CNN that the Guthrie family's public statements were not spontaneous outpourings of grief. Instead, their messaging throughout this entire ordeal had been meticulously managed with guidance from the FBI's own crisis negotiators and hostage recovery specialists. Every single word released to the public, he asserted, was deliberately chosen and refined with the direct input of these federal experts. If Savannah's acknowledgement of her mother's potential death was indeed a component of a carefully constructed FBI-guided message, it would suggest that investigators are now conditioning the family for the worst. This is a step authorities seldom take unless their own internal assessment of the situation has taken a dark and decisive turn. And now, the investigation must turn to the medical professionals, because the question of Nancy Guthrie's survival after the events of February 1st is not merely a matter of emotion, but one of cold, hard physiology. The conclusions provided by doctors and other specialists paint a deeply unsettling picture. Sleep expert Pat Byrne, speaking on Crime Stories with Nancy Grace, addressed the precise chain of events that investigators believe transpired. He considered the scenario of Nancy Guthrie being violently roused from sleep in the dead of night, around 2 in the morning, and then forcibly taken from her own home. He explained a phenomenon known as sleep inertia. At 2 a.m., she would likely have been in either a state of very deep sleep or what is known as REM sleep. If she was in a deep sleep, she would be incredibly confused, he stated, continuing, "That concerned me immediately. The medical literature is clear that elderly individuals, even those without pre-existing heart conditions, face a profoundly elevated risk of heart attack when violently awakened from a deep sleep." It was then that Byrne arrived at the single most critical detail in this medical analysis. Nancy Guthrie's heart was not that of a typical elderly person. She depended on a pacemaker, a medical device implanted within her chest for the explicit reason that her heart was incapable of reliably regulating its own rhythm without technological intervention. Byrne explained that the combination of being brutally awakened from deep sleep, the profound disorientation of sleep inertia, and the physical trauma of a violent abduction, for an 84-year-old woman with a known cardiac vulnerability, placed her at an exceptionally high risk of a fatal cardiac event in the initial moments of the ordeal. Not as an eventual outcome, not after weeks of being held captive, but within the first few minutes. Dr. Shrihari Naidu, a board-certified cardiologist and a professor of medicine at New York Medical College, provided an additional clinical perspective to this grim assessment. Dr. Naidu clarified that pacemakers are generally implanted in elderly patients who suffer from bradycardia, which is a dangerously slow heart rate that cannot sustain life without electronic stimulation. For a patient of Nancy's advanced age with this specific condition, he noted, A sudden and severe physical shock to the system would trigger grave cardiac repercussions. The heart, already critically dependent on a device just to maintain a basic rhythm, would be subjected to sudden and overwhelming physiological stress. The body would be flooded with adrenaline. Blood pressure would surge. The heart would begin to race uncontrollably. In a young, healthy person, the system can generally manage such a shock. The heart possesses the reserve capacity to absorb the impact. In an 84-year-old patient with a pacemaker, that same reserve capacity is simply not there. The cardiac risk, he stressed, is not a theoretical possibility. It is an immediate and life-threatening certainty. There is another piece of medical evidence, recovered from the crime scene itself, that forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden analyzed when questioned about the blood discovered on Nancy Guthrie's front porch. It was Nancy's blood, a fact confirmed through DNA analysis. The pattern was not a smear or a swipe from a wound. It was distinct drops, and these drops had pale centers. This specific morphology, Baden explained, is characteristic of blood that originates from the nose or mouth, as it has been mixed with air upon expulsion. Blood from the nasal passages or the mouth, not from a cut on the hand or a scrape on the knee. It came from her face. Baden's conclusion was that this physical evidence was consistent with either a direct blow to the face or a forward fall onto a hard surface. It was the type of impact that would cause a person to bleed from the nose or mouth in droplets onto the ground below. An 84-year-old woman, reliant on a pacemaker, is violently awakened, potentially struck or knocked down, and is already bleeding from her face before she has even been removed from her own property. Her medications were all left behind. While this fact has been noted in the coverage of the case as something that adds urgency to the search, it deserves a more meticulous examination, because, within the calculus of survival probability, it is among the most consequential pieces of information authorities possess. Nancy Guthrie relied upon a daily regimen of medication to manage her heart condition. Sheriff Nanos confirmed this fact without ambiguity, stating that she required it for her very survival. That vital medication was found sitting on her kitchen counter or inside her medicine cabinet when investigators processed the scene. It was not taken with her. For an 84-year-old woman dependent upon a pacemaker, how long could she possibly endure without the daily cardiac medication that sustains her life? Medical authorities have been deliberately cautious, declining to specify a public timeline without knowing the precise details of her medication regimen. Yet, the clinical consensus for elderly patients on such essential cardiac support is grim. Missing even one dose can catastrophically destabilize the very heart rhythm the medication is meant to maintain. To miss multiple doses, over a period of days and then weeks, while a person is already under extreme physiological duress, fundamentally rewrites the calculus of survival. The window of hope narrows, not from a matter of weeks to months, but from a matter of days to even fewer days. Then, the investigation deployed the signal sniffer. This was the one detail that pierced through the carefully managed public language of the case, exposing what investigators were truly searching for. Ashley Banfield delivered the report, citing her law enforcement sources on Drop Dead Ad Serious. It's now confirmed that the Puma County Sheriff's Department collaborated with a partner agency, deploying a specialized detection system into the unforgiving desert terrain. Their focus was Santa Cruz County, near Rio Rico, in the vicinity of where an initial person of interest who was quickly cleared had been intercepted. They utilized a signal sniffer, a piece of technology designed specifically to detect the faint electronic whispers of Bluetooth signals in the field. The stated objective was to search for the signal from Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker, but Banfield's sources were specific about what investigators believed that signal would ultimately lead them to: not a living victim concealed in a structure or a vehicle, but a body. They were looking for human remains in the desert. This is not rumor. This is reporting from named law enforcement sources provided to a journalist with direct contacts inside the FBI. Cadaver dogs had already been used in the earlier phases of the investigation, and now a signal sniffer was being aimed at the vast, open desert. The investigative posture, the chosen technology, the targeted terrain, and the language used by sources all indicate the grim mechanics of a recovery operation, not a rescue. But it is here that this conversation must be handled with care, because there is a counter-argument, and it is not a weak one. Sheriff Chris Nanos has never declared Nancy Guthrie to be deceased. He has not, in any public statement, shifted his language to that of a homicide investigation. And during one of his most emotionally candid interviews, when a Fox 10 reporter pressed him on whether Nancy is still alive, he provided an answer that demands to be taken seriously. He said, "You have no proof, nobody does, that she's not alive. I'm going to have that faith. Sometimes that hope is all we have." That statement carries immense weight, not because it is the declaration of a man in denial, but because it is the statement of a law enforcement officer who is bound by what he can reveal publicly, and who knows that the absence of a body signifies the absence of proof. In the eyes of the law and the investigation, Nancy Guthrie is missing, not deceased. She is missing, and that distinction is vital for the investigation, for the family, and for the public. CNN's John Miller confirmed this investigation is nowhere near going cold. He stated it explicitly. This is nowhere near a cold case. There is still plenty of science that is out that has not come back yet. There are still investigators pursuing active leads that they are not finished with. If this same conversation were taking place a year and a half from now, Miller admitted, that would be a cold case. But the situation right now, in its current state, is profoundly opaque. Opaque. Not closed and not abandoned. Simply opaque. And then, there is the precedent set by the survival of other kidnapped victims. Elizabeth Smart was abducted from her Salt Lake City home at age 14 in June of 2002. She was held captive for 9 months. She was found alive. J.C. Dugard was abducted in California at the age of 11 in 1991. She was held captive for 18 years. She was found alive. In both of these instances, the public had surrendered hope. In both, law enforcement had quietly reallocated resources and altered its assumptions. In both cases, they were wrong. Kidnapped victims survive captivity when there exists a reason to keep them alive. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, a reason does exist. The ransom notes. Multiple media outlets received communications that demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin. The notes contained specific, non-public details about Nancy facts that could only have been known by someone with direct involvement in the situation. This included a single detail about the location of her Apple Watch that was not public information at the time. If someone is holding Nancy Guthrie and has a genuine intention to ransom her, then her survival is in their best interest. A living hostage is leverage. A dead hostage is evidence. Former FBI hostage negotiator Rich Franla stated it directly. What you are hoping for is that the hostage taker responds back, that they are still communicating, that there is still a transaction to be negotiated. The ransom notes have never been definitively proven authentic, but neither have they been definitively dismissed as fraudulent. And as long as that ambiguity remains, so does the possibility that Nancy is alive. The medical survival question also contains a counterpoint that merits acknowledgement. The pacemaker's data stream went dark at 2:28 a.m. This was not because the pacemaker failed, but because the Bluetooth connection between the device and Nancy's phone was severed by distance. The pacemaker itself is an implanted, autonomous device, a silent guardian deep within the body that requires no external connection to perform its critical function. It doesn't need a cellular signal to regulate Nancy's heartbeat. Its sole purpose is to maintain that rhythm, whether or not it is transmitting data to some distant monitoring application. So, if Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home, even with speed, even under the duress of extreme violence, that device would not have failed her. The pacemaker was methodically regulating her cardiac rhythm. It was still functioning. Distance may have silenced the signal to the outside world, but it did not silence the patient's heart. The question of her medication is a far more serious matter. Yet even cardiac patients who miss their prescribed doses do not always suffer an immediate and fatal collapse. The timeline for medical deterioration is a chillingly unique variable, determined by the specifics of drug dosage and the complexities of individual physiology. The only honest medical answer is a void. We simply do not know how long she could survive. No expert, outside of those who personally treated her, can say for certain. So what does the totality of expert opinion actually tell us? It paints a grim, statistical picture. The probability of Nancy Guthrie being found alive diminishes with every single passing day. Now, at 6 weeks out, with no verifiable proof of life, no ransom demand ever confirmed by the FBI, and no indication of a medical resupply, the outlook has darkened considerably. The experts who speak publicly, once cautious, are no longer using the optimistic language of rescue. The IB Times UK summarized the forensic community's somber, collective assessment in the plainest of terms. Hope is waning. But they did not, and this is critical, say that hope is gone. And the distinction, the vast and silent space between waning and gone, is where this entire investigation now lives and breathes. It lives there because the Federal Bureau of Investigation is still working this case around the clock. It lives because the painstaking genetic genealogy analysis is still running. It continues because the mixed DNA profile recovered from the crime scene has not yet been fully isolated and identified. The investigation endures because the damaged utility box is still undergoing forensic examination, and because the January 11th surveillance sighting is still being meticulously cross-referenced against every frame of footage from the surrounding neighborhood. It persists because somewhere, buried in a server, captured by a doorbell camera, logged in a cell tower record, a single piece of data exists that will finally answer the question that haunts every expert involved. What truly happened to Nancy Guthrie? Not just who abducted her, but the more terrifying question of what happened in the hours and days that followed. Clinical psychologist Emily Mellon at Tufts Medical Center spoke to News Nation about the specific kind of agony that families experience when a loved one vanishes and no answer ever comes. She said it's a horrifying experience losing a loved one for any reason, but when that loved one is a missing person, there is also an abyss of open and unanswered questions. She described the unique torment born from the uncertainty of a missing persons case, the inability to properly grieve, the incapacity to heal, the paralysis that prevents planning for a future because that one, all-consuming unanswered question overshadows everything. Savannah Guthrie described this very reality from the inside. In a moment of such raw emotion, it seemed to transcend television. She told her Today colleagues, "I wanted you to know that I'm still standing, and I still have hope, and I'm still me. And I don't know what version of me that will be, but it will be. I don't know what version of me that will be. A daughter, living inside the single hardest question of this case, not knowing, but still standing, still hoping. The most difficult question in the Nancy Guthrie case does not yet have an answer. Where medical experts have outlined the grim physiology, former agents have laid out the cold, investigative logic. The cadaver dogs, once a sign of hope, have been pulled back. In their place, the signal sniffer has been deployed. The FBI command post has relocated, and through it all, nobody has been found. And yet, no proof of death has emerged. No family member has been told to prepare for the worst. This remains an active investigation. The DNA is still being processed. The investigation is now expanding its timeline, digging deeper into the past, while sharpening its forensic analysis of the present. Until there is definitive proof, one way or the other, the only honest answer to that hardest of questions is the same one Sheriff Nanos gave. You have no proof she's not alive. Sometimes, hope is all that remains, and sometimes, hope is enough. If you possess any information, no matter how insignificant it may seem, regarding the Nancy Guthrie investigation, please call 1-800-CALL-FBI right now. A reward of $1.2 million is waiting for the one tip that either brings Nancy home or provides her family with the answers they so desperately deserve. Because when this case finally breaks, and it will break, the full story needs to be told. You will want to be here when it happens.